Start. Okay, my name is Elyse Therrien. I am the in-store dietitian at Loblaws. I think the number one comment I get after that is, I didn't know that Loblaws had dietitians, so I'm there. So in terms of supporting at the grocery store or anything, right, I'm definitely a liaison there. But I did want to talk today. Actually, I don't want to see any of you because you make me very nervous. So they're gone now. Just kidding. I'm sure you're all very nice, but spaz. You've noticed. So I want to talk a little bit about today is the MIND diet. So in my kind of bio, it was described that I like to stay up to date on current scientific knowledge. I always kind of call myself a little bit of a nerd. So the MIND diet is kind of the most recently researched diet when it comes to preventing or managing dementia or any kind of cognitive decline. So we'll start there. So this actually is a slide that's also used in like a Gray Matters presentation. But what affects our memory? There's a lot of things, right? So when we look at health or when we look at nutrition and diet, we know that hypertension and heart disease, diabetes and obesity, all these things can affect cognitive decline. And I might say this several times throughout my presentation, but normally what we say is good for the heart is good for the brain, and the same is said of the opposite, right? What's bad for the heart is bad for the brain. So you'll see a lot of kind of parallels going forward. So different reasons why. So having high blood pressure does kind of put the blood vessels at risk in your brain, right? So a higher risk of stroke. Stroke means death of brain cells, right? Not great for cognitive decline or brain health. Diabetes. So has anyone ever heard of Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes? Right, so we know that having high blood sugars long-term can affect cognitive decline. And obesity obviously puts us at higher risk of both of these things and more. So when you actually have all three of those classifications, your risk of developing Alzheimer's or dementia is actually 6 times higher than kind of the average population. So it's really why having kind of that preventative approach, and I find that this is something in dietetics we talk about a lot, is we want to prevent problems, right? So kind of getting ahead with good nutrition, healthy foods, real foods ideally. You'll notice that a lot of the foods I talk about are just regular old mill foods, but just keeping that in mind, right? So what is the MIND diet? It's a cute name. I think they worked on it really hard to make sure the acronym made sense. But it is a diet created to reduce the risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So there's similar patterns between the DASH diet and the Mediterranean diet for heart health, right? So again, what's good for the heart is good for the brain. So DASH stands for the dietary approach to stop hypertension. And most of us know the Mediterranean diet, right? Kind of based on the Mediterranean. So MIND actually stands for Mediterranean Dash Intervention for Neurodegenerative Delay Diet, or commonly called MIND. So it's been modified to put more emphasis on foods or nutrient linked to improve cognitive or brain function. So they've kind of broken it down to 10 food groups to include and 5 food groups to avoid, right, or to limit. And the summary of these food groups are all on the next slide. But some research suggests that strict adherence to this diet, so this is kind of the most hopeful we can be, is it's shown it might reduce the risk of Alzheimer's by 53%. Right, so far research is looking good with this approach, and you'll notice some similarities. So it's rich in nutrients like vitamin E, DHA, which is one of the types of omega-3, B vitamins, vitamin C, D, healthy. There's a healthy balance of fats, but I'll kind of break that down through the different foods that they suggest. So this is the important slide. This kind of highlights everything that there is to know about the MIND diet. So the 10 food groups to include, so green leafy vegetables, any other kind of vegetables, nuts, berries, beans, whole grains, fish, poultry, olive oil, and wine. Who's relieved to see wine? Yeah. See, we're fun sometimes too as dietitians. But we do want to limit red meats, butter or margarine, so stick margarine, so margarine's made with hydrogenated oils. Cheese, which makes this French girl very, very sad. We did mention that I was French, my background is, so seeing that broke my heart a little bit. Pastries and sweets, fried or fast foods. So to break these down into those foods, so there are some common nutrients I think that a lot of people will recognize. So omega-3 we know is kind of anti-inflammatory, good for the heart, good for the brain. There's healthy fats, antioxidants, which I misspelt. B vitamins and fiber. And this is how you'll find it. So dark leafy green vegetables, we do suggest 6 servings a week. So that could be extrapolated to almost once a day, right? Ideally, in anything nutrition, we like to see things spaced out nicely. Here are some examples, because I like pictures and colors. It also helps me talk less, of different green vegetables. I think probably the most common are spinach and kale. Kale has gotten very popular in the last few years. But there's things like Swiss chard, collard greens. A lot of people are using dandelion greens, but it can be as easy as a romaine lettuce, right? Usually I say it's anything that's leafy that isn't iceberg, right? To kind of give you that idea. One serving is considered 1 cup of the raw vegetable. So if we're seeing a little bit of a, loss of appetite, or for any given reason, right? Someone's having a hard time eating. These vegetables, when they're cooked, tend to shrink down a lot, right? So if you think of a cup of spinach, for example, if you steam it, it might shrink to a 1/4 cup size, so it makes it a little bit more attainable in terms of eating it. Now, the reason why I think that these are important is obviously there are some good antioxidants in dark green vegetables. They tend to be sources of vitamins A, C, and E, which are all different antioxidants, and really good sources of fiber, right? So fiber is going to help keep us full, but it helps regulate blood sugar. It helps to keep us full, so it helps maintain that healthy weight. So it's kind of lots of reasons to include those. Other vegetables, we just suggest 1 serving a day. So pick your color, any color. And there's a whole lot of benefits to that too. We know that orange vegetables tend to be a better source of vitamin A, right, which is an antioxidant, but they're all going to be sources of fiber. They're all nutrient dense. No one's ever surprised to hear the dietitian say, eat more vegetables. So I digress, I'll move on. Berries, we do suggest 2 servings a week. Ideally, the nice dark colors, right, are indicative of a good source of antioxidants. But they'll also be a good source of fiber, and we do see that the glycemic index on berries, so that's how much your blood sugar is going to be affected by the food you eat, we see in berries it's really low. So in terms of blood sugar control and kind of the risk of diabetes or the use of insulin by our bodies, we see a more beneficial impact on berries as opposed to any other type of fruit. So you'll notice that I don't really mention fruit for the rest of the presentation, but there is that emphasis on berries. Not to say that you shouldn't still eat the apple. If you love apples, have the apples, right? This is just kind of the minimum, get you started. They do suggest 5 servings of nuts a week, which is actually the same recommendation for someone who has high cholesterol. So part of the reason this is important is nuts are a source of protein, so it might displace another kind of meat source, which is higher in saturated fats. But they're also a source of healthy oils, right, healthy fats, and a source of fiber as well. So multifaceted, again, good reasons to have nuts. They tend to be good sources of liposoluble vitamins, which are the vitamins that need fat to be soluble, right? So vitamin E is kind of the best example of that one because it's an antioxidant, right? So some vitamins actually do need a certain amount of healthy fats to be absorbed and to work properly. But they'll also be a good source of fiber, which isn't typically found in meats, right? I always say fiber is kind of the bones of plants. So anything that doesn't have bones has fiber. Anything that does have bones does not have fiber. 1 serving is considered a 1/4 cup. I don't know how many of you carry around cups, sort of measuring cups all the time, so I usually just say a small handful, right? It's a little bit more feasible. I like to pair that with the berries too, right, to kind of make that healthy snack. There's a picture coming up of kind of healthy snack ideas and a healthy meal, how to put it together. But just keeping those ideas running all the time, it's kind of boring to think of sitting down to eating 1 serving of nuts, but how to integrate it is kind of interesting. Another interesting addition is there is the walnuts there. So walnuts are one of the vegetarian sources of omega-3. So when I get to fish, we'll kind of talk about that too. But I do find that fish can cause some issues, right? Because the sensory piece, and it just tends to be the trickier food to eat. So there are other ways of getting nice omega-3s in our diet. They're just not the same types of omega-3. This is the last food I think that it talks about protein. So legumes, so beans, peas, and lentils are all other suggestions, at least 4 times a week. Again, I think it's going to displace a little bit of the saturated fat from regular meat, but also adds fiber, magnesium, and all the B vitamins, which B vitamins are super important to maintain cell health, so all cells in the body, including brain and heart. Here are examples of different beans and legumes. Actually, 2016 was the year of the pulse, so I rejuvenated my love of beans, peas, and lentils. So talk to me about them all the time. But definitely, I had black beans today for lunch, actually. I feel very dietitian-y. I can tell you guys what I had for lunch today, and it sounds very dietitian-y. But things like lentils, beans, chickpeas, they tend to be really easy to just open and consume. We've actually come out with frozen versions of a lot of these things. So if opening a can might be difficult for, like if there's arthritis or there's the movement there, again, occupational therapy can assess. But there are some nice options, right? And I find too, if there are just 1 or 2 people at home, like I'm the only one that eats beans at home because my fiance is a typical dude and eats a lot of meat. So when I open a can of beans, I have to eat it within those 3 days because I'm the only one doing it. So having the frozen option is kind of nice because you can portion it out yourself. Next is whole grains. So just briefly, we know that there's 3 parts to a grain, right? So the outer layer is the bran, that's where all the fiber is. There's the middle layer, the endosperm, that's where you find most of the starch and the energy. And the germ has some healthy fats and the nutrients, right? So having the whole grain is really gonna bring you all of the benefits to it. Again, the fiber will help reduce cholesterol, it'll help keep you full. The germ is where you're going to find a lot of those healthy nutrients to maintain cognitive or brain health or cognitive function. So 1 serving, again, don't know how many of you carry around a measuring cup with you all the time, but about the size of your fist is 1 serving, right? So that's about half a cup or so. So they do suggest 3 servings a day of whole grain. Now, a lot of people say that's a lot of bread. Well, there's so many other grains in the world that we should reinvest in, right? Like quinoa, a brown rice, a farro, which is what I had on my lunch. See, I told you I had a dietitian lunch today. I had farro for lunch. So just kind of reinvesting in those different grains. And again, it might help keep things interesting, or depending on how far the cognitive decline is, it might be more uncomfortable. So kind of finding where someone's level of comfort is with their food, if they're still open to trying new things, or if that kind of gets them more interested in eating, then that's also kind of a benefit. Brings us to fish. Everyone's seen the size of the deck of cards for the serving of meat. So we do suggest that in this diet, 1 serving of fish per week, which is a little bit lower than what we normally talk about. Health Canada does suggest 2 servings of fish a week, at least 1 of which should be a fatty fish. So here it is, the suggestion is for the fatty fish, right? So I always say that the pink fish tend to be the fatty fish because they're the good source of omega-3. So omega-3, again, lots of different reasons why it's important. It is important for brain health. I'm going to check my timer. Perfect. But also it has positive effects on cholesterol levels. So again, blood pressure, heart health, brain health, all wrapped into 1. With other real meats, they do suggest 2 servings of poultry a week, so white meats typically. And again, probably because they're lower in saturated fats. And when I did the math of how many servings of protein foods that this diet suggests, it's actually 13. So if we think of there's 7 days in the week, right, there is some room for maybe more fish or maybe more legumes. Maybe there is room for some red meat, right? But if you think you're having protein at least twice a day, we're right about that, right? 13, you're just 1 short for that 14th serving. So it's kind of good recommendations there. And of course, we can't talk about anything about the Mediterranean diet or that's influenced by the Mediterranean without using olive oil. And again, this is to substitute saturated fat. So it's not just saying add olive oil everywhere. It's saying probably where we're using saturated fats, whether that be butter or hydrogenated margarine or coconut oil, perhaps replace it with olive oil. Other healthy fats are great as well. So if you think of canola oil, soybean oil, I can go on. But this particular diet that's being studied is suggesting the olive oil. Now, wine, and a lot of people are going to think this is high, so 1 serving a day. And I did bring copies, and they're in the back of the Mediterranean Diet Pyramid, and it's a big figure in the Mediterranean diet. And I think a large part of it is the antioxidant content, right? And it's just a little bit of fun, I think. And it does kind of depend too on where we are in the progression of the disease. Obviously, sometimes alcohol is not the first thing we'll recommend, but if we're still in the preventative stage or early stages, right, and it might be part of a social activity, and we know that being social plays such a big role in preventing cognitive decline, I think that's great. Eating together, right, and if it happens to have a glass of wine with dinner, awesome. And then we want to limit the brain unhealthy foods, right, so the red meats, the pastries, the deep fried foods, the cheese, and the butters. So limit, it's kind of a vague term. Not everyone agrees on what that means by limit, but anything you're doing now, there's always a step to we can do a little bit better. So if we have dessert every day, does it go to having dessert every other day? And replace 1 serving with maybe those berries, right? Replace the simple sugars with the complex carbohydrates. In practice, this might be what your plate looks like, right? Like a nice salad with 2 different types of vegetables, whole grains, and I took my glasses off so I actually can't see what that is, and a fillet of salmon. I'm going to say that actually looks like spelt. And for dessert, have the berries and have a glass of wine with it, right? So this is it in practice, right? A lot of me talking about servings of food, but this is putting it together. And here are a different example of snacks. So a bowl of walnuts again. This looks like an oatmeal or possibly a chia pudding, right? Different options. Roasted chickpeas, that's another nice crunchy one. If you're the type to sit down to popcorn, you might enjoy that. Or that looks like a Ryvita cracker, so a whole wheat cracker with some different, it looks like a bruschetta kind of topping onto it. So again, food should be fun. It shouldn't be prescriptive, right? It should still be tasty, and healthy foods can be very, very tasty. Luckily, I had dinner before I came, so this is not making me overly hungry, because usually it does. And then the plate method also works, right? So if we think of filling half that plate with vegetables, a quarter plate with your starch or your carbohydrate, and a quarter plate with your protein of sorts, that's kind of a guaranteed to have that healthy plate. Now, you can buy kind of separated plates, which can be reminders as well, that have kind of the image of the different food groups, so that can be helpful as well, just how to portion it out properly. I saw a really funny comic once, so this plate portioning really works well for me, and it's piled high, right? So just being mindful still of the hand kind of portion sizes that I mentioned. And then this I added, now I do have two handouts at the back. One is about nutrition specifically and one's about eating, but kind of common challenges that we see with cognitive decline. So something like a loss of appetite. The first thing you want to do is definitely rule out any other reason for the loss of appetite, right? Like it might be heartburn, they might be having mouth, like their dentures aren't fitting properly, or they might have sores in the mouth. It might be because they're having incontinence issues, so they know they're associating the food to the urgency. So kind of eliminating that process. Any medication or depression, right, might be underlying there. So if you rule all those things out, I would say definitely wanting to stick to regular meal times. That's a helpful kind of, it'll stick to their hunger cues, it'll probably stimulate their metabolism properly. Sometimes you'll want to reduce the size of the meal, right, so they're not overeating at, say, lunch, so they're not hungry enough at dinner, so small frequent meals might be useful. You definitely still want them to eat when they're hungry. I always say in my practice I have two very strict rules. One is don't eat foods you don't like. Two is eat when you're hungry, right? So you want to allow them to listen to their hunger cues as much as possible, depending on, again, how far it's progressed. If they've forgotten that they've already eaten, that's something to assess as well. Provide balanced meals to make sure that they have enough protein to keep them full long term, that they have enough fiber to get that full feeling. They're not just kind of filling up on air. If they are having problems with either diarrhea or constipation, kind of looking at hydration, looking at the amount of fiber, again, a dietitian can help assess that. Make sure that meal times are simple, calm, again, hopefully social and enjoyable. It might just be a simple placemat, like a place setting, right, to kind of make things a little bit easier to go over. Overeating is often, again, like someone might forget that they've eaten. So you want to keep everything clean and tidy. Right? We were talking about keeping the kitchen safe and tidy. Again, we talk about eating smaller meals so that they have kind of that frequency, but it's already kind of portioned out so they're not overeating. You might want to keep lower calorie snacks or healthy, like if you have crackers or carrots, celery, and hummus, right? So that they're healthy for them, but they're not going to overload the daily kind of calorie allowance. Go for walks or go for the social interaction, right? That's super important. But kind of the flip side to that is if they tend to pace a lot, right? If we're seeing kind of the fidgeting that sometimes can be associated with cognitive decline, sometimes their calorie needs actually increase, right? Because we don't want to see we don't want to see the muscle mass decreasing kind of thing. Other things, some medications sometimes will cause kind of that craving for sweetness, so keeping an eye out on that. A lot of people will start forgetting to eat, so setting alarms or calling your loved ones just to kind of keep that. I've set many an alarm on many people's foods, especially for breakfast, because I think the morning tasks get overwhelming that you can forget to eat breakfast if it's not kind of in that routine. Chewing problems, again, making sure that occupational therapy can help with that, making sure that they're not choking, making sure that the dentures are well fitted. When they are eating, focus on the food, right? It should be pleasant, light conversation, but let them focus on food. Again, one thing at a time. Maybe they need to eat, and I still do this. I don't like when my food touches. I eat my salad first, and then I have my carbohydrate because I'm a carnivore, and then maybe I'll have my protein because I like my carbs better. You might need to moisten food, right? Or thicken food, mince food, different textures might help. You can look at, we mentioned Meals on Wheels. If we're not quite that far, we can do microwavable meals. I can help kind of find the easier things to put together. I work at the store, I go up and down the aisles a lot. I know kind of some of the easier things to put together, or something that's a bit healthier that you can just throw in the microwave that's a bit easier. But even kind of like finger foods might be helpful, right? Because if they're having a hard time with utensils, I mean, there are adaptive tools, right? Like if they love soup, there's adaptive tools that you can use, a spoon that almost folds in half. It's really cool. But looking at how can they still eat with dignity, right? How can we still eat together, but everyone's eating the same food, or everyone's eating in the same way? So there, like I said, there's a lot of handouts at the back with some really good tips. It gets pretty specific because everyone's experience with dementia is different. So they do have a lot of really neat tips and tricks there. This kind of goes over, so again, keep it simple. Keep in mind past history with food, because they might kind of regress that way. Watch the food temperature. We don't want to be serving cold food or overly hot food, and make sure that they hydrate, because that's an easy thing to forget too, right? And that can cause kind of the constipation issues or anything. But otherwise, that was me. I think I stayed good on time, and I'll be there for questions at the end. Thanks for listening, guys.